The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of Johnson's Market, casting long shadows across the produce aisle. Raymond Johnson moved deliberately between the fruit stands, picking up apples and examining them with careful attention. His tall frame and well-tailored suit made him stand out among the regular shoppers, but not in a way that should have aroused suspicion. Mrs. Henderson, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, approached him with a warm smile. "Senator Johnson, it's good to see you shopping local." Raymond responded with a courteous nod, maintaining his usual diplomatic demeanor despite the informal setting. Several other customers noticed him, offering respectful waves or quiet greetings. The peaceful atmosphere shattered when two police officers burst through the entrance, Officer Mike Sullivan and Officer James Barrett, responding to what they would later claim was an anonymous tip about suspicious activity, scanned the store with hands hovering near their weapons. Their boots squeaked against the linoleum floor as they moved purposefully toward the produce section. Raymond noticed them, but continued shopping, decades of experience telling him that any sudden movement could be misconstrued. He reached for a bunch of bananas just as Officer Sullivan's voice cut through the air. "Sir, put your hands where we can see them." The senator turned slowly, hands rising with deliberate care. "Officers, I'm just doing some shopping. Is there a problem?" His voice remained steady, measured, the same voice that had commanded respect in countless Senate sessions. Officer Barrett stepped closer, his hand now firmly gripped on his weapon. "We received a report of suspicious behavior. Don't move." The officer's eyes darted to Raymond's pocket, where his phone created a slight bulge. Several customers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward. "Officers, this is Senator Johnson. He's a regular." "Ma'am, step back," Officer Sullivan barked, cutting her off. "Sir, remove anything from your pockets, slowly." Raymond's heart raced, but his exterior remained calm. "I'm reaching for my ID," he announced clearly, moving his hand with exaggerated slowness toward his jacket pocket. Before his fingers could touch the leather of his wallet, Officer Barrett lunged forward, grabbing Raymond's arm and twisting it behind his back. The force of the movement sent both men stumbling into the fruit display, sending apples rolling across the floor. "Stop resisting," Barrett shouted, though Raymond had offered no resistance. "I am not resisting," Raymond managed to say, before his face was pressed against the cold floor. The weight of both officers pinned him down, their knees digging into his back and legs. The market erupted in shocked voices. Phones emerged from pockets recording the scene. Mrs. Henderson's voice rose above the others. "This is outrageous. That's Senator Raymond Johnson." But the officers continued their rough handling, patting him down with aggressive movements. Raymond could feel the grit of the floor against his cheek, could smell the mix of cleaning products and crushed fruit. His perfectly pressed suit collected dirt from the market floor, but the physical discomfort paled in comparison to the humiliation burning through him. "Help!" Raymond called out, his voice strained but dignified even in this position. "Someone please call my office." The crowd grew larger, their murmurs of disapproval growing louder, but no one dared to intervene directly against the armed officers. The scene that would soon spark a movement across Chicago continued to unfold in the fluorescent-lit market as a respected state senator lay face down on the floor, surrounded by scattered produce and the shocked faces of his constituents. The verification of Raymond's identity took an excruciating 7 minutes. Only when the store manager arrived with a newspaper featuring the senator's photo did the officers finally release their hold. Officer Sullivan's face drained of color as recognition set in, while Barrett maintained his defensive stance. "Our apologies, Senator," Sullivan muttered, stepping back. "We were responding to a credible threat report." The words rang hollow in the tense atmosphere of the market. Raymond pushed himself up slowly, his joints protesting from the rough treatment. His suit, usually immaculate, was now stained with dirt and produce residue. A small cut on his cheek left a thin line of blood trailing down his face. He straightened his jacket with as much dignity as he could muster, though his hands trembled slightly. The crowd parted as he walked toward the exit, their phones still recording. No one spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken outrage. The same people who had greeted him warmly minutes ago now watched with a mixture of shame and anger. Shame for not intervening. Anger at the system that allowed this to happen. Outside the market, Angela Johnson stood frozen on the sidewalk. She had arrived to meet her brother for lunch, only to find police cars parked haphazardly in front of the store. When Raymond emerged, she immediately noticed his disheveled appearance and the defeat in his usually confident stride. "Ray," she whispered, reaching for him. "What happened in there?" Raymond raised his hand, stopping her approach. His eyes scanned the gathering crowd, aware that this moment would define him in ways his political career never had. "Not here," he said quietly. "Let's go home." In Angela's car, Raymond finally let his carefully maintained composure crack. His hands, still dusty from the market floor, covered his face. 20 years in the Senate," he said, his voice rough. "I fought for change from within the system, played by their rules, earned their respect, and still..." He left the sentence unfinished. Angela gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles white. "This isn't about you not being respectable enough, Ray. You know that." "I know," he replied, touching the cut on his cheek. "But knowing doesn't make it easier. I saw the fear in those officers' eyes, Angela. They didn't see a senator. They didn't even see a man. They saw a threat, because that's what they've been trained to see." "What are you going to do?" Angela asked, already knowing her brother's political career would demand a measured response, a diplomatic statement about unfortunate misunderstandings. Raymond stared out the window at the Chicago streets passing by. Streets he had walked countless times. Streets he had fought to improve through legislation and community programs. "I don't know," he admitted. "For the first time in my political career, I honestly don't know." The car fell silent as they drove through familiar neighborhoods. Both siblings understood that this incident would force them to confront questions they had spent years carefully navigating: how to balance progress with pragmatism, personal dignity with political necessity, and individual trauma with collective action. Angela's living room became command central by nightfall. What started as a few concerned phone calls transformed into an impromptu gathering of community leaders, activists, and longtime family friends. They sat wherever they could find space, on couches, chairs pulled from the dining room, and even cross-legged on the floor. Marcus Thompson, a journalism student from Northwestern, sat in the corner with his camera equipment. He had been documenting cases of police misconduct for his thesis when social media exploded with videos from the market. He arrived uninvited, but was welcomed after explaining his project. "The footage is already viral," Marcus reported, scrolling through his phone. "Over 50,000 shares in just a few hours. People are angry, especially since it's you, Senator." His camera captured the tension in the room, the way people leaned forward when speaking, the nervous energy in their gestures. Reverend James Carter, who had known Raymond since childhood, stood by the fireplace. "This isn't just about what happened to Ray. This is about every Black person who walks into a store and feels those eyes following them. Every parent who has to teach their child how to survive a police encounter." Angela paced the room, her teacher's instinct for organization taking over. She wrote key points on a whiteboard she'd dragged from her home office. Documentation, legal action, community response, media strategy. "We need to be smart about this," said Lisa Martinez, a civil rights attorney who had dropped everything to attend. "The department will try to minimize this, call it an isolated incident. They'll dig into the senator's past, looking for anything to justify their actions." Raymond sat quietly, still in his stained suit. The cut on his cheek had been cleaned, but was starting to bruise. He watched as his personal humiliation transformed into something larger, something beyond his control. The chief of police already issued a statement, Marcus added. Standard procedure. Officers responding to a credible threat. Unfortunate misunderstanding. Internal review promised. His tone made clear what he thought of such promises. The room erupted in overlapping voices, each person sharing similar stories. Sons stopped for driving nice cars. Daughters followed in department stores. Elderly parents harassed for walking in suspicious ways. Angela slapped her hand against the whiteboard, cutting through the noise. We need action, not just talk. The community needs to see us standing up. Tomorrow morning, I propose we organize a peaceful demonstration in front of police headquarters. It needs to be more than just another protest. Raymond finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of his position and newfound purpose. We need to show them that this isn't just about one senator being mistaken for a criminal. It's about a system that assumes criminality based on skin color. Marcus raised his camera. I'll document everything. Create a narrative they can't ignore or twist. The planning continued into the night. Phone calls were made, social media accounts were activated, and press releases were drafted. What had started as a response to one incident was evolving into a coordinated movement. By midnight, when most had left, Angela found Raymond still sitting in her living room, staring at his reflection in the dark window. You don't have to be the face of this, she said softly. Yes, he replied, touching his bruised cheek again. I do. Because if they can do this to a state senator in broad daylight, imagine what happens to those without my privileges, without cameras recording. The morning brought crowds that exceeded even Angela's optimistic expectations. What began as 100 people swelled to thousands within hours. Local news vans lined the streets around police headquarters, their cameras capturing the sea of protesters holding signs. Respect knows no color. Senator today, who tomorrow? And end police brutality. But Raymond wasn't there. He sat in his home office, watching the coverage on multiple screens, while his phone buzzed constantly with messages from fellow politicians, reporters, and party leaders. Each caller wanted the same thing, for him to control the narrative, to calm the situation, to be reasonable. Your political future is at stake here, his chief of staff warned during a tense phone call. The governor is concerned about the optics. The party needs you to handle this diplomatically. Raymond watched Angela on TV, speaking to reporters with passionate eloquence. The camera cut to Marcus, whose documentary footage from the market incident was now playing on national news networks. The bruise on Raymond's cheek had darkened overnight, a persistent reminder in his bathroom mirror of choices to be made. His mother's arrival was unannounced. Martha Johnson, age 78, still carried herself with the dignity that had sustained her through the civil rights movement. She found her son surrounded by political advisors and PR specialists, all offering careful strategies for damage control. Everyone out, Martha commanded with quiet authority. The room cleared quickly, leaving mother and son alone. I taught you to tie a tie in this room, she said, adjusting his collar out of habit. Taught you to hold your head high, to be twice as good, to play their game better than they could. She touched his bruised cheek gently. But I never taught you to be silent. Raymond closed his eyes, feeling the weight of generations. If I speak out too strongly, I could lose everything I've worked for, the relationships I've built, the influence I've gained. And if you don't speak out, Martha interrupted, you'll lose something far more valuable. She turned his chair to face the TV screens, where the crowds continued to grow. Look at those people. They're not just protesting what happened to you. They're fighting for what you represent. The idea that playing by the rules, achieving success, wearing the right suit should be enough. But it's never enough, is it? The room fell silent, except for the muted chatter of news coverage. Raymond watched young children on their parents' shoulders, elderly people in folding chairs, people of all races holding signs with his name. His phone buzzed again. another party leader demanding he defuse the situation. Raymond declined the call. "When they pushed you to the ground," Martha asked softly, "what did you think about?" "I thought about Dad," Raymond admitted. "How he'd faced the same thing 30 years ago, without cameras, without a senator's badge to save him." Martha nodded. "The only difference between then and now is that you have a voice they have to hear. The question is, will you use it?" Raymond stood, straightening his tie one final time. The movement had grown beyond his control, beyond his careful political calculations. His mother watched as he picked up his phone, not to return the frantic calls from party leadership, but to call Angela. "I'm coming to the protest," he said simply. "It's time to speak." The crowd parted like waves as Raymond made his way to the makeshift podium. His usual security detail had been supplemented by community volunteers who formed a human chain around him. The bruise on his cheek, now clearly visible, became a symbol captured by dozens of cameras. He hadn't prepared a speech. For the first time in his political career, Raymond Johnson decided to speak purely from his heart. The microphone carried his voice across the square, where people had fallen silent in anticipation. "2 days ago, I was just buying fruit," he began, his voice steady. "Like any other citizen, like any other human being." He paused, looking across the sea of faces. "But I wasn't treated like any other citizen. I wasn't treated like a human being." The crowd's energy shifted, their collective breath held. White residents in the crowd exchanged glances with their black neighbors, understanding deepening in real time. "For years, I've worked within the system. I've passed legislation. I've sat on committees. I've negotiated with those in power. I believed that change could come through proper channels." His voice grew stronger. "But when I was face down on that floor, my credentials didn't matter. My votes didn't matter. My humanity didn't matter." Angela stood to his right, tears streaming down her face. Marcus moved through the crowd, his camera capturing not just Raymond's words, but the impact they had on each face in the audience. "This isn't just about me," Raymond continued. "This is about every parent who has to have the talk with their children. This is about every professional who gets followed in stores. This is about every citizen who has to prove their right to exist in their own neighborhood." The crowd began to respond, their voices rising in agreement. People of different races reached for each other's hands, forming spontaneous bonds of solidarity. "Chicago, we are better than this. America, we are better than this." His voice carried years of contained emotion. "We don't need more committees. We don't need more studies. We need change, and we need it now." The response was thunderous. Signs waved, people embraced, and a chant began to build. "Change now, change now." News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene as it spread beyond the square. In nearby offices, workers pressed against windows. On social media, the hashtag #YouChangeMustCome started trending nationally. Raymond's speech continued, outlining specific demands: independent investigation of police conduct, mandatory body cameras, community oversight boards, and comprehensive reform of police training. "This movement isn't against the police," he clarified. "It's against a system that allows bias to determine who deserves dignity. It's against the assumption that the color of our skin makes us suspicious. It's against the idea that some citizens have to prove their right to exist, while others are automatically granted it." As he spoke, reports came in of similar gatherings forming in Detroit, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Chicago had become ground zero for a national conversation about police reform and racial justice. The speech ended with a promise: "I will not stop. We will not stop. Not until every citizen can buy fruit without fear. Not until every parent can stop having the talk. Not until justice means justice for all." The first threat arrived by email at 3 a.m. A week after the speech, Raymond sat alone in his study, reading the message that detailed his daily routine with disturbing accuracy. His morning jog route, his favorite coffee shop, his mother's address. The sender remained anonymous, the message clear: back off or else. He deleted the email but couldn't delete the knot in his stomach. The house felt too quiet, too exposed. His security team had already identified 3 suspicious vehicles monitoring his home in the past week. Each day brought new concerns, new threats, new reasons to question his decision to speak out. Angela's situation wasn't any better. That morning, while leaving her classroom at Chicago Public High School, 2 plainclothes officers approached her in the parking lot. They leaned against her car, badges visible, faces wearing practiced smiles. "Miss Johnson," one officer said, "we're concerned about your involvement in these activities. Teachers should set a good example, don't you think? It would be a shame if something affected your career evaluation." Angela straightened her spine, channeling her mother's strength. "Are you threatening a public school teacher for exercising her constitutional rights?" "Just a friendly conversation," the other officer replied, pushing off her car. "Think about your future, Miss Johnson. Think about your brother's future." When she told Raymond about the encounter that evening, his hands shook as he poured their coffee. Their weekly family dinners had become strategy sessions, with extra security posted outside the house. "They're trying to find our pressure points," Raymond said, setting down the coffee pot before he could spill it. "I've discovered that the 2 officers from the market incident have extensive complaint records, all buried by internal affairs. Someone's protecting them." "Who?" Angela asked, though she suspected she knew. "Commissioner Davidson has connections to several city council members, the same council members who opposed my police reform bill last year." Raymond pulled out a file Marcus had helped him compile. "It's a network of protection and silence. They cover for each other, promote each other, protect each other." The doorbell rang, making them both jump. It was just their mother, but the moment of fear revealed how much their lives had changed. Martha noticed the extra security, the drawn curtains, the way both her children scanned the street before stepping outside. "You're not backing down," she said. It wasn't a question. "Can't," Angela replied. "But they're not making it easy." Raymond showed them another email he'd received, this one containing photos of him taken through his office window. "They want us to know they're watching. They want us afraid." "Are you?" Martha asked, looking at both her children. Angela thought about the officers in the parking lot, about her students watching her response to intimidation. "Yes," she admitted, "but I'm more afraid of what happens if we stop." Raymond nodded, touching his cheek where the bruise had faded, but the memory remained sharp. "The threats mean we're hitting something sensitive. They wouldn't bother if we weren't making an impact." As they talked, Marcus's latest documentary footage played on the TV, showing their movement's growth, the increasing diversity of supporters, the way other cities were adopting their demands. But it also showed the cost: protesters being arrested, supporters losing jobs, families facing harassment. This isn't just about police reform anymore, Raymond realized. We're exposing a whole system of power and privilege. They're not just protecting those 2 officers, they're protecting their entire way of operating. The community center buzzed with tension as Raymond took his seat at the front table. On one side sat community members, activists, and concerned citizens. On the other, Police Commissioner Davidson and the 2 officers from the market incident, Sullivan and Barrett, flanked by their union representatives. The town hall meeting, designed as a dialogue for understanding, felt more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. News cameras lined the walls, and Marcus positioned himself strategically, his lens capturing every subtle expression. Commissioner Davidson spoke first, his rehearsed words falling flat. "We acknowledge there may have been a misunderstanding, but our officers followed standard protocol based on the information they had at the time. Raymond leaned forward to his microphone. Standard protocol includes throwing a clearly identified public servant to the ground? Tell me, Commissioner, what information justified that response? Officer Sullivan shifted uncomfortably, but Barrett's face hardened. We received a credible threat report, Barrett interjected, despite his union rep's warning hand. Any officer would have responded the same way. Would they? Raymond pressed. Show us this threat report. Share the caller's information. Explain why no investigation of the caller was ever conducted. The room temperature seemed to rise as Barrett stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're trying to paint all officers as racist. We risk our lives every day while politicians like you play victim for cameras. The crowd erupted. Shouts filled the air as people rose from their seats. Angela, watching from the side, saw several plainclothes officers moving through the crowd, seemingly agitating, rather than calming the situation. Order! The moderator's voice was lost in the chaos. Raymond remained seated, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the growing storm around him. Officer Barrett, his voice cut through the noise. Your reaction proves exactly why we need reform. When questioned, you respond with anger. When challenged, you escalate. This is precisely the behavior that makes our communities feel unsafe. Barrett moved toward Raymond, his face red. You want to talk about safety? Let's talk about the death threats our families are receiving because of your crusade. Like the threats my family receives from your colleagues? Raymond stood slowly. The difference is, we don't have badges and guns to hide behind. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Protesters outside the center, hearing the commotion, began pressing against the doors. Police units arrived with riot gear, their presence further agitating the crowd. Angela grabbed the microphone. Everyone, please, this is exactly what they want. Chaos. Don't give them the excuse they're looking for. But her words came too late. Someone, later investigations would never determine who, threw a chair. The crash of breaking glass followed, and suddenly, the room devolved into pushing and shoving. Raymond found himself face to face with Barrett again, this time surrounded by chaos instead of produce. You're destroying everything we've built, Barrett growled. No, Raymond replied calmly, even as people rushed past them. We're exposing what was already broken. The meeting ended in a blur of tear gas and shouting, with several arrests and multiple injuries. News helicopters captured the scene as protesters and police clashed outside the center. Chicago's attempt at dialogue had become another flashpoint in a growing national crisis. Millennium Park pulsed with the largest gathering Chicago had seen in decades. 50,000 people filled the space, their breaths visible in the cold air. The stage, hastily constructed the night before, stood as a beacon under the winter sky. This wasn't just another protest. It was Raymond's moment to either unite or divide the city. He stood backstage, watching the crowd through a gap in the curtain. Angela adjusted his tie, her hands steady despite the stakes. Remember, she whispered, they're not just here for you. They're here for what you represent. The diversity of the crowd struck him. Black mothers with children on their shoulders, white college students holding signs, Latino business owners who'd closed their shops to attend, Asian community leaders who'd mobilized their neighborhoods. Chicago's true face, unified in purpose. Raymond stepped onto the stage, and the roar of the crowd physically pushed him back. But something felt wrong. Through the glare of the lights, he noticed tactical units positioning themselves around the park's perimeter. Police helicopters circled overhead, their rotors cutting through the winter air. My fellow citizens, he began, his voice carrying across the park. Look around you. This is what they fear. Not our anger, not our demands, but our unity. They fear us standing together, seeing each other's humanity. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his words. From his vantage point, Raymond could see police lines beginning to tighten, riot gear gleaming under the winter sun. They tried to silence us with threats. They tried to divide us with violence. They tried to break us with fear. His voice grew stronger. But here's what they don't understand. We are no longer asking for change. We are becoming the change. Suddenly, flashbang grenades exploded at the crowd's edges. Panic rippled through the gathering as police lines advanced, claiming they'd received reports of imminent violence. Angela rushed to the microphone. "Everyone stay calm. Link arms. We trained for this." The crowd responded, thousands of people joining hands, forming human chains of resistance. Raymond's security team tried to hustle him off stage, but he shrugged them off. Instead, he descended into the crowd, linking arms with those around him. Angela joined him, then Marcus, with his camera still rolling. Together, they stood as the police lines approached. "Stay peaceful," Raymond's voice carried over the tension. "Let them see who we really are." The police advance slowed, faced not with chaos they could justify controlling, but with disciplined, peaceful resistance. News cameras captured it all. The unnecessary police presence, the peaceful protesters, the clear attempt to provoke violence being met with dignity. Commissioner Davidson, watching from his command center, ordered the use of tear gas. But several officers removed their riot gear instead, some even joining the protesters. The images shocked the nation. Chicago police officers choosing humanity over orders. The confrontation lasted hours. Raymond stood his ground, his suit collecting snow, his voice growing hoarse but never stopping. He led the crowd in songs, in chants, in prayers, in moments of complete silence that spoke louder than any shout. By nightfall, what could have been another tragedy had transformed into something else entirely. A testament to the power of united, peaceful resistance. The police withdrew, leaving the park to the protesters who'd never thrown a single stone. The police department's press conference started with an announcement that shook the city. Officer Barrett had been terminated. Commissioner Davidson, looking uncomfortable and aged, read from a prepared statement about maintaining public trust and accountability measures. But Raymond, watching from his office, knew this was just the beginning, not the end. The independent investigation he demanded had started turning up disturbing patterns. Decades of buried complaints, systematic cover-ups, and a network of corruption that reached far beyond the police department. "Look at this," Angela said, spreading documents across his desk. Marcus had helped them obtain leaked internal affairs files. Every time Barrett or Sullivan faced complaints, the same names appear in the review process. And these names connect to campaign contributions to specific city council members. Raymond studied the papers, his legal training kicking in. They're not just protecting bad officers, they're protecting a system of power. The police union, certain council members, property developers, private prison contractors, they're all connected. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off now. Final warning." Attached was a photo of his mother's house, taken that morning. But they had prepared for this. Martha had already been moved to a safe location. Their network of supporters had created a sophisticated system of protection and surveillance. The community was watching the watchers. Later that day, Raymond received an unexpected visitor. Officer Sullivan requested a private meeting, arriving alone and visibly nervous. "What I'm about to tell you," he said, glancing around Raymond's office, "puts my life at risk." For the next hour, Sullivan detailed a conspiracy that went beyond their worst suspicions. The attack on Raymond hadn't been random. Certain power brokers had wanted to send him a message to remind him of his place. But they hadn't expected the incident to be filmed, hadn't anticipated the movement it would spark. Barrett was just the fall guy, Sullivan explained. The real players are still in place. They're planning something bigger to discredit your movement. They've got people inside your organization, waiting to create a violent incident they can use against you. Raymond recorded everything, his hands steady despite the implications. "Why are you telling me this now?" Sullivan looked down at his hands. "Because my daughter attended your speech in Millennium Park. She asked me which side of history I wanted to be on. I didn't have a good answer." As Sullivan left, Raymond immediately called Angela and Marcus. They had hours, maybe days, before their opponents made their move. The evidence Sullivan provided was explosive, but they needed more than just one officer's testimony. "We need to take this public," Angela argued. "Release everything at once." "No," Raymond countered, years of political experience guiding him. "We need to be strategic. They're expecting us to rush, to make mistakes. We need to be smarter." They worked through the night, connecting dots, verifying information, building an undeniable case. The real battle wasn't just against corrupt officers or racist policies. It was against a deeply entrenched system that profited from division and fear. The press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m., but by 8 a.m., Raymond's enemies had already begun their counterattack. Local news stations received anonymous tips about Raymond's radical past. Social media flooded with doctored photos suggesting violence at his rallies. The police union announced they had evidence of protesters planning attacks, but Marcus was ready. For months, he'd been documenting everything, creating an unassailable record of the movement's peaceful nature. As the false narratives emerged, he systematically released video evidence disproving each claim. Raymond stood at the podium, Angela and Sullivan beside him. News cameras rolled as he opened a thick folder marked "Evidence." "Today, we're not just exposing corrupt officers," he began. "We're exposing a system that turns police officers into tools of oppression against their own communities." He held up documents, emails, and financial records. These papers show how certain city council members, working with private prison contractors and real estate developers, have profited from over-policing in minority neighborhoods. Sullivan stepped forward, his testimony adding weight to each revelation. He detailed how officers were pressured to make arrests in areas marked for future development, how complaint files disappeared, how whistleblowers were silenced. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions flowing through shell companies. Internal memos revealed explicit discussions about using police pressure to drive down property values. Body camera footage, secretly preserved by concerned officers, showed systematic abuse of power. Commissioner Davidson attempted damage control, calling an emergency press conference. But before he could speak, his own officers began turning in their badges, refusing to be part of the corrupt system any longer. The city council chamber erupted in chaos as arrest warrants were served. 3 council members were led out in handcuffs, their connections to the corruption fully exposed. Private prison executives frantically shredded documents, but Marcus had already secured copies of everything. Raymond watched from his office as the system began crumbling. His phone rang. The governor, then senators, then national news networks. What started as one incident in a Chicago market had exposed corruption across multiple states. Angela found him there, staring out his window at the city skyline. "Was it worth it?" she asked. "All the fear, the threats, the risk?" Raymond touched his cheek, where the bruise had long faded, but the memory remained eternal. "Look," he said, pointing to the streets below. Officers and community members were embracing, barriers of distrust finally breaking down. That's worth everything. The final scenes played out over the following weeks. Reform legislation passed with unprecedented support. The police department underwent a complete restructuring, with community oversight boards given real power. Officer training was revolutionized, focusing on de-escalation and community engagement. 1 year later, Raymond stood again in Johnson's Market, buying fruit. The same officers were there, but this time they were walking the beat, knowing shoppers by name, part of the community rather than apart from it. A young black boy watched him, recognition dawning. "You're the senator," he said, "the one who changed things." Raymond handed him an apple. "No," he replied, smiling at the boy's mother. "We all change things, together." The movement that began with one man face down on a market floor had transformed into a national model for reform, proving that justice, while slow, was possible when people stood united against systemic corruption.